Hello, everyone. This is Marilyn Vann. I'm glad that you are here today. Now, this is the history of the Cherokee Freedmen, and I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Freedman ancestry. So let's go to the first slide. Okay. Now, originally, the Cherokee Nation had citizenship through clans. Everyone was adopted into a clan or generally got their citizenship through their mother. With the what happened in the 1820s was laws began to be passed against persons with African ancestry. The first law forbade the freeing of a slave in order to marry the person. Then we got jumped to the 1827 Constitution, where persons who had a Indian father and a white mother could have citizenship, but not people with a Indian father and a mother of African ancestry. Things just began to go downhill from that, where for people that, again, most of the persons in the tribe were slaves. Now, prior to the 1820s, yes, there had been some persons of African ancestry adopted into clans. Now, there were blacks who slaves who tried to escape, such as those with the Richard Jovan slave revolt. Let's go ahead and move forward here. On the next slide. Now, who are the Cherokee Freedmen? Okay, these were mostly black slaves, the Cherokee Indians, and some free blacks, almost all who had a Cherokee ancestry, who legally lived in the tribe. They came from the South with the rest of the tribe. These the term freedmen really didn't come up until after the Civil War. Some have tried to say the freedmen people were squatters or tenants, but that's not true. Free black people or escaped slaves were just not allowed to stay in the Cherokee Nation. That is just not the way that it was. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now I mentioned the Civil War. One of the reasons that the Civil War came into being was about slavery, and the leadership of the tribe, most of them were slave holders, not all. So that's the reason for the Confederate Treaty. The National Council did pass a law in 1863 to end slavery. That did not make the freed slaves or any of the free blacks who weren't recognized as citizens at that time. It did not give them citizenship. Now, during the Civil War, there were persons of African ancestry who fought in the Union as Union soldiers. I mentioned the name of a couple of them. One that fought in the Indian Home Guards, Mr. Baldridge, and then a Mr. Johnson who fought in the colored infantry troops. Now, the reason for the treaty was that of 1866 was because to reestablish the government-to-government relationship between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. After all, that stopped when the Confederate Treaty had been signed. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, we get to the Treaty of 1866 in the next slide. Now, that treaty, which again was approved as an act of Congress, signed between the Cherokee Nation leadership and the United States, it permanently ended slavery and stated that those colored persons, both those that had been enslaved as well as the free blacks, would receive the rights of Native Cherokees. That included the right to hold office in council, the right to sue in the federal court if unjust laws, to appeal to the president if the freedmen were discriminated against by the tribal government. Now, there was a limitation as to what freedmen received these treaty rights. That was those who had either had never left the Cherokee Nation or returned to the nation after within 6 months of the ratification of the treaty. So you couldn't just come in here in 1880 or 1890 as a person of African ancestry and said you were entitled to citizenship. It just didn't happen. Next slide, please. We go on to the 1839 Constitution. Now, which was amended in 1866. According to a proclamation made by Chief Ross, again, who was a Princeton educated lawyer, he asked the citizens of the nation to change the Constitution to line up with the treaty. The people did that. So this amended Constitution in November of 1866, it removed the discriminatory laws that were against persons of African descent in the Cherokee Nation. So persons of African ancestry were able to hold office, were able to marry any citizen that they wanted to. So all of this was a good thing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, some persons have said the leadership of the Cherokee Nation didn't understand the treaty, or that the persons of African ancestry were supposed to have citizenship. Maybe the people were just supposed to be able to peacefully live there. Well, that's not what the leadership believed. What I have down here in this next slide is information where there were hearings in Tahlequah in 1885, where there were persons who came from the U.S. Senate, and they asked leaders and former leaders, well, what did the treaty mean? What were the rights of these persons of African ancestry? Well, former Chief Ross, he made it clear that the freedmen had citizenship in the tribe through the treaty. So did the current chief, Mr. Bushyhead. And he also talked about the numbers of persons who were citizens of the tribe, colored citizens, based on the 1880 census. We also have the former judge who even talked about the rights of the freedmen. Yes, we understood they received the rights based on the 1866 treaty. Again, all of these are public documents available in the federal libraries. So again, all public knowledge. Anybody can research these documents. Now, let's go to the next slide. There were persons in tribal leadership, of course, who really didn't support the freedmen holding office. They were okay with freedmen holding office, but sharing in the funds of the nation mostly was the issue. So Congress, they passed some laws to allow the freedmen people sometimes to file litigation or outright be able to participate in a share of the tribal funds. Now, some of this discrimination wasn't only regarding the freedmen, but also the Delaware and Shawnees, who were adopted citizens in the tribe. So this slide talks about some of the acts of Congress and also mentions the Whitmire case, which was one of those that dealt with the freedmen being able to share tribal funds during the 1890s. Next slide, please. Now, there were freedmen who were able to hold office and were prominent men. I mentioned some of the freedmen who served in office in the 19th century. Some of these individuals, such as Stick Ross, Jerry Alberti, Ned Irons, Fox Glass, Frank Vann, they have descendants that are members of the Cherokee Nation right now. I know personally that some of these good people. Freedmen served as educators, were businessmen. I mentioned here Moses Whitmire, Zach Foreman. He has many family members registered in the tribe right now. Even the town of Foreman is named after Mr. Foreman, which is in Sequoyah County. There were lawmen such as Isaac Rogers, the federal marshal. Of course, there were criminals like Cherokee Bill, who were freedmen. Freedmen were educated under tribal law. Now, freedmen listed on the 1870, 1880, 1890 censuses that the tribal government made. The National Council approved the 1880 census that these are our citizens. I want to point out that nobody was listed with a degree of blood, because these were not things that the tribal governments had. I mean, after all, what American citizen or citizen of Canada has a degree of American blood? Freedmen, they spoke the Cherokee language, ate traditional food. Freedmen churches such as Antioch Church in Tahlequah, the people spoke, there were services in the Cherokee language. I mean, after all, what were the language that people were going to be speaking? Let's go to the next slide. Now, adopted Shawnees in Delaware. We have Shawnees in Delaware that were adopted based on agreements between the Cherokee Nation and the federal government, the United States government. Again, when these people came in, and there's a list of, for instance, of Shawnees in Delaware that came in, there were no blood quantums for them either. And there was also some Delaware that were entitled, based on their agreement, the original ones that came in, to larger allotments if the Cherokee Nation reservation was allotted. So, and that also included the white people that were members of the Delaware tribe who came to the Cherokee Nation. Now, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, which deals with the Dawes Enrollment. Now, the Dawes Enrollment was important because the Dawes Enrollment actually was the one that set up which people were the federal government considered to be freedmen, and the ones who were Cherokees by blood or intermarried whites or the like. And again, I already talked about the Delaware, about 200 people who were entitled to the bigger allotments. Their children were registered on the Cherokee by blood census. Now, what was the reason to have some of these different lists? It all dealt with property, when the allotment was going to be sold. So people that were listed as freedmen, their allotments were sellable in 1904 and not a later date. The Dawes Enrollment ended in 1906. It was just a snapshot of people, about 41,000 people who were members of the tribe at that time. Now, almost all the people who had African ancestry were listed as freedmen. Now, that didn't necessarily mean that they had no Indian ancestry. I mentioned, for instance, Anthony Crittenden, who on the 1880 census, he's listed as a native Cherokee. I mentioned here Perry Ross, who was on listed as a freedman, but his brother was listed as one half Cherokee by blood. Now, George Hammer Brown, Perry Ross's brother, all of his children were all listed as freedmen. A lot of consistencies. Again, it dealt with property, when your property could be sold. Now, one thing that some people are not aware of is they say, well, the freedman, that if a freedman really had Indian blood, he would have been put down as a Cherokee by blood. Well, that's not how it happened. Also, another thing is, under the 1902 agreement between the Cherokee Nation and the U.S., you didn't get an allotment if you were if you died prior to September of 1902. So a lot of freedmen that were listed, they didn't have a parent or grandparent, even if the people had been legally married, who was still alive at that time. So that didn't affect the other people, it affected the freedmen. Let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, to the next slide. Between 1906 and 1970, there really wasn't much of a tribal government. The federal government had appointed chiefs. In Oklahoma, you have these Jim Crow laws, segregation laws. The persons of one drop of African blood, you're legally a Negro. So this affected the freedmen, not others. People such as W.W. Hastings, They became U.S. congressmen, Robert L. Owen, U.S. senators, but at a time when persons of African ancestry couldn't even vote, much less hold office, due to these grandfather clause bills. We go ahead and jump on to the next slide. I just wanted to touch on a few some litigation in the earlier part of the 20th century that mentioned freedmen's rights. 1906, there was a Supreme Court case that really dealt with the rights of intermarried whites, but it mentioned that freedmen had their full citizenship rights due to the 1866 treaty. There was another, later on, there was another case, a court of claims case that dealt with freedmen being able to get some per capita payments, and the freedmen didn't even have to go to court. Federal government protected the freedmen in this litigation. So the freedmen received the per capita payments, just as freedmen received their tribal allotments when the Dawes rolls were made on the same basis so far as the amount of acreage as everyone else. Going on, we get to the 1970s and 1980s. After the Principal Chiefs Act was passed, the members of the 5 tribes are able to vote for the principal chief. The tribal government, so far as courts, tribal councils, all begin again. And the freedmen are able to vote in some of the early elections. The freedmen vote, a few freedmen vote on the 1975 Cherokee Constitution. But then as we start getting into the 1980s, the freedmen began to have problems. Some of it are issues with the tribal leadership at that time. So the freedmen began to be barred when they go to vote, barred when they ask for services. There wasn't necessarily legislation passed, but it just happened. You were turned away, go away. Let's go to the next slide. So finally, when we get to the 1990s, there are laws passed that, as part of the tribal code, that block freedmen from citizenship and voting. Well, the freedmen, of course, fight this. There was a case filed by Bernice Riggs in the tribal court, the JAT, although he found out that her ancestor list as a freedman did have Cherokee ancestry. Basically, they said, well, go away, and we don't have to register you. There was the 1999 convention was held to deal with the new constitution. There were no freedmen there, but the most important thing was that this was going to remove Department of Interior approval for new constitutions and constitutional amendments. Again, the word freedman was not actually mentioned at the in that constitution. Now we get to the early 2000s in the next slide. The federal government refuses to approve the new constitution because the freedmen didn't get to vote on it. Now so again, in 2001, the freedmen people began to start organizing. The Descendants of Freedmen Association, of which I'm the president, was started to fight and also provide education about the rights of the freedmen. This again, there was a big push by the administration to get this 99 Constitution approved. We go on to the next slide. So we get a lawsuit filed by the freedmen descendants, a Cherokee Freedmen, regarding the rights of the Cherokee Freedmen, and also to block this new constitution from coming in. Originally, the tribe was not a party to the lawsuit or any tribal leader. 2005, the tribe jumps in to try to block the get rid of the Freedmen lawsuit. The federal judge does not dismiss the lawsuit. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, meanwhile, while we have this federal litigation, we also have actions going on in tribal court. A Cherokee Freedmen descendant, Lucy Allen, she files a lawsuit. And the judges, the three judges at the Judicial Appeals Tribunal, they ruled that under the tribal constitution, the freedmen do have citizenship rights. So the tribe does begin to register some freedmen. The current chief at that time, Mr. Smith, he publicly opposes this and calls for a new constitutional amendment to remove the freedmen. So meanwhile, another completely different tribal court lawsuit is filed, and the tribe begins to operate under the 99 Constitution. So there are some additional judges. We go on to the next slide. There is a, so after the chief calls for a new constitutional amendment, there is a new constitutional petition. That's taken out. Several tribal council persons, they do go and get signatures. There's a lot of shady things that go on there. Tribal funds are used. Now, I was very involved in watching how this petition was going. Myself, I would go and bring the press. There were, the petition was passed out. People got signatures and on tribal properties, these kind of things that were done. Now, so after the 90-day period, about a third of the signatures were thrown out by the election commission itself, because the people were not even registered voters. I looked at some of the names, and the people were not even members of the tribe. They were members of other tribes. Okay, now we go on. So, of course, the freedmen, they challenged this petition. There's 5 judges. 2 of the judges don't want to approve the petition. They write dissents because of all of the fraud in there. But there are 3 judges who state that there are 81 more signatures than needed for this petition to be approved. So again, the Supreme Court decisions of the Cherokee Nation, those are public for anyone to read, as well as the dissents. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so there is a vote in March of 2007. Now, there's not that many people that actually vote. There are that vote on this, about 8,000 people, but it is true more than 70% of the people who actually voted, they do vote for the freedmen to not be members of the tribe. So there we are. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, now again, like I had mentioned, by this time, there were not that many. There were about 8,000 people, less than 8,000 people who voted. Now, the federal government had already said that they would not approve this amendment. By the time of this vote, there were about 2,800 people who were registered members of the tribe as freedmen. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, well, there was a lot of, course, the freedmen went to the federal court and it asked the judge to nullify this petition. Well, I shouldn't say it. It was an amendment by that time. Again, it was the Department of Interior had already said that it would not be approved. And So the tribal leadership, they backed off. They said, well, they would look at it again in the tribal court. And so the letters that the freedmen people received saying that they were no longer members of the tribe, those letters were rescinded. So so now we have a case in tribal court as well as this federal court case that's moving forward. There was a 2007 election for tribal officers. The freedmen people that were members of the tribe, they do vote, but the tribe does not register any more freedmen as members of the tribe at that point. So the federal case continues on. So then we get to 2009, where the Cherokee Nation files its own case against some freedmen litigants, and actually it's 5 freedmen who live in the state of Oklahoma in the Northern District, and also the Department of Interior, saying that the tribe wants a federal judge to make a decision on the freedmen rights. Okay, then we go to, so this case is filed. So then following up with that, the tribal council approves the litigation and says that the litigation, whatever the judge decides, is going to be binding on the nation. All the tribal council approve this, all 17 people. Again, this resolution, it's anybody can look at it and read it. Okay, so let's go ahead and go forward. That is Tribal Resolution 22.09. And so it waives the sovereign immunity of the tribe. You can't really go into federal court and ask a judge to make a decision and then not be bound by the decision. Let's go ahead and keep moving. Next slide. Okay, we go on forward here. There are members of Congress who are very surprised by what happened to the Cherokee Freedmen. One of the things that happened here was that there was a law passed, out of the House Financial Services Committee that removed the federal approval. Excuse me. There was a law passed that tied the Cherokee Nation housing funds to the freedmen, continuing as members of the tribe during the litigation period. So this was passed in 2008. So the original bill was HR 2786. Okay, well, moving on. As I said, we have now we have 2 cases in federal court. We have 1 case in tribal court. So the case that was filed by the nation is moved to Washington, D.C. at the request of the freedmen attorneys and also the Department of Interior. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So we get to 2011. A lot of things happen in 2011. The Cherokee Nation Judge Cripps, he rules that the freedmen do have rights. Again, this is in the tribal court. The tribal attorney general appeals this. There is an election going on, a pretty contentious election between Mr. Baker and Mr. Smith. And so for those that were voters at that time, if you remember, the first election was thrown out. There's a subsequent election that's going to be held in September. And so meanwhile, Mr. Crittenden was sworn in as the deputy chief. So we move on to the next slide. Well, again, we're still in 2011. So the tribal court rules against the freedmen there in, before the second election that happens. The freedmen challenged this again in federal court. Then the tribal funds are frozen. Everybody goes to Washington, D.C. an agreement is worked out that the freedmen will be voting, can't be removed from the tribe during the litigation period. So that gets us into late September, where again, the freedmen, as well as everyone else in the tribe, votes again. Mr. Baker is elected for the chief. The housing funds had been temporarily frozen for a few weeks, but after the election and after the agreement, the funds are restored to the nation. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay. In the next slide here, again, there had been a lot of activity with the federal cases. So for the second time, the first case, the Vann case, had the appellate court had refused to dismiss it. So we wind up with the two cases in DC continuing to operate. So we go to the next slide. Okay, so finally, we get all the parties agreeing that a judge is going to make this decision on the merits of the case. This is Judge Hogan by this time. So in 2014, he hears oral arguments. What are the rights of the freedmen? Did the federal government take the rights away? In 2014, again, he hears these oral arguments. So let's go to the next slide. In 2017, Judge Hogan rules the freedmen have all the rights of Native Cherokees and that they cannot be just removed from the tribe at will. He requires an end of the moratorium on freedmen registration. Again, the freedmen have equal rights to Native Cherokees. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, Chief Baker announces this decision will not be appealed. And so this decision becomes a part of the Cherokee law. So the tribe begins to register freedmen and ends discrimination against the freedmen within the tribe, and also works to end discrimination against the freedmen that is part of that other tribes are doing. For instance, there were some tribes that might not accept a freedman at their clinic, and the Cherokee Nation was working to try to end this kind of discrimination. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, now, of course, there's some that did oppose this. So some went to the Cherokee Nation court and to try to force the Attorney General and the chief to appeal the decision and the order that had come down from Judge Hogan. This was I believe it was like 8 people, including 2 persons on the tribal council. Again, all of this is public knowledge. The tribal attorney general asked that this action be dismissed. Now, let's go to the next slide. Okay, well, it was dismissed. So things move forward with the freedmen registration. That was most of the actions that were coming on immediately after the decision of the Judge Hogan and the decision of the Cherokee leadership in the Cherokee courts. Now, one thing that happened in 2020 is this McGirt case. This actually dealt with the Creek Nation, whether the Creek Nation had a reservation. The U.S. Supreme Court held that Article 3 of the Creek Treaty, which dealt with the reservation, was still there. And the reservation had not been extinguished. Well, later on, the Cherokee Nation also had filed briefs and in cases, and it was determined that the Cherokee Nation treaty was still intact, including the reservation. So this really more had to deal with criminal cases, but the important thing is that the U.S. Supreme Court was determining that these treaties were still intact, and which we already knew, of course. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. The next thing that's happening within the Cherokee Nation deals with the right of the freedmen to hold office. Myself, I'm Van, went to filed for the tribal council office. I was challenged by this by another candidate, Mr. Mays. When this happened, the Attorney General for the Cherokee Nation requested that the order that was the order of the effect of the Cherokee Nation v. Nash and Vann cases become permanent, and that the by blood language in the Cherokee Nation Constitution and the Tribal Code be removed. Now, that was in February of this year. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. Well, the Tribal Supreme Court, they do finalize the preliminary order from August of 2017. The by blood provisions were removed. The Cherokee Nation Election Commission, they do approve not only Marilyn Vann's candidacy, but also two Shawnee candidates, Mr. Hudson and Mr. White, because again, removal of these by blood provisions not only affects the rights of the freedmen, but also the rights of the Delaware. And I want to reemphasize that in the 19th century, after the 1866 treaty, that Delaware, Shawnee, other adopted classes, including freedmen, all had the right to hold office based on these agreements between the federal government and the and these nations. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now again, there was, as I said, challenges have been raised between myself, the candidate, as well as the other persons. The final result is that all the candidates were held by the election commission in the courts to be eligible to hold office. So the candidates all continued their all the candidates continued their races. Then the final thing that happened is that the Cherokee Nation Constitution was finally approved by the Secretary of Interior, Ms. Holland. And the Department of Interior press release said that the Cherokee Nation was meeting its treaty obligations to the freedmen people. Okay. All right. So a lot has happened this year as far as the freedmen. Now, let's go to the next slide here. What I have here is there are many people who are freedmen descendants that are people of note in the 20th and 21st century. Some of these people are, I mentioned here, Sam Ford, a journalist, Kenneth Cooper, journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, Colonel Kenneth Wofford, who happens to be deceased, Dewey McLean, Georgia State, Georgia, not George, state legislator. These are not the only people out here. Now, some of the people I mentioned have a freedman ancestor, but are not necessarily members of the tribe currently, or they're registered as members by blood. Mr. Chris Penn. But as I said, there are some noted people. Don Ross, former state House of Representatives. Okay, let's go ahead and keep it moving here. Now, I also wanted to mention some of the freedmen who have been key in this fight for 1866 treaty right enforcement. Now, it wasn't just freedmen descendants, freedmen tribal members who were very key to this. There were a lot of great people. But I'm just right here, I just wanted to mention the names of some of the freedmen people: Mrs. Rosalind Brown, William and Waynetta Laurie, Vicki Baker, Ruth Nash, myself, Deacon King, Reverend Adair, Sam Ford, Rose Khalid, and again, there were others. But I wanted to get some of the names on one sheet of paper. And, I just wanted to give a shout out to some of these good people. Okay, now let's go to the next page. There are some different books about the Cherokee Freedmen and Freedmen descendants. So I wanted to mention that for people who would like to read. Excuse me. Apartheid in Indian Country by Hannibal Johnson. That's a great book. He's an attorney, but it's not in a lot of legalese. Ty Wilson, a Cherokee Freedman, lives in Tahlequah, great guy. He's written a book. Taya Miles, professor up at Harvard, she's got a good book. Darnella Davis, Creek citizen, who also has a Cherokee Freedman ancestor, she's written a book. Dr. Sturm, Professor Littlefield. There are some good books out there. And also for those folks that are on the internet, there's various people who have written papers about the Cherokee Freedmen. So I just invite people to look at some of this, read some of these great books that are out there. Now, let's go to the next slide here. Okay, place to get some more information. Descendants of Freedmen Association, we occasionally have public meetings. I haven't had a lot of meetings with this COVID thing, but we have a website. Again, I'm just giving, there's a Facebook page for the Descendants of Freedmen. Also for the African Indians Foundation page. There are some information sources out there on the World Wide Web. So, and I just encourage people to, avail themselves for these resources. Now, I didn't make a page that lists some of the people that are Cherokee Freedmen descendants that are working in community organizations. Some of these good people, my dear friend Rosalind Brown, who has been deceased for over a year, she has had a great community organization that her daughter has now taken over, the Project A, a great community leader. Vicki Baker, who is the president of the Pocahontas Club, a person working in the community. Also, even some of the at-large organizations, Barbara Warren and the DC Capitol organization, the president of it, my good friend Mark Harrison, who is descended from Jerry Alberti, who's on the board of the Cherokee Community Organization in the Oakland area. My good friend Mark Harper up in Kansas City. So as I said, there are freedmen people who are working to build their own communities. So with this, I wanted to leave some time for questions and answers. So let's go ahead and if there are some questions in the chat, I am ready to answer these questions. And if not, and if nobody has any questions, I can certainly keep talking, but I wanted to answer questions.
Thanks for your presentation this morning, Marilyn. It's been wonderful, and that's a lot of the feedback that we're receiving in the chat right now. Chief Hoskins says, great presentation. Lori also says it's been a wonderful presentation, and Widow for your time today as well. So I'm sure that we will continue to have some feedback that comes through. And so we'll allow for a few minutes for it. I just want to say thanks for being here with us today and presenting such a comprehensive overview of such an important history within our communities as well. And so the love just keeps pouring in. We've got much appreciated. And Mark says, Widow Marilyn, and thank you so much for your time this morning for sure. And we feel that, definitely, we all do. I want to thank everyone for being here with us this morning. And you have leading expert here with us. So if you have any questions that you'd like to field, now is definitely a good opportunity to do that as well. And it's a rainy day for us here in Tahlequah. So hope you've been able to cozy up with a good blanket, maybe a cup of hot tea, and join us in our conference. I know we miss being face to face, but one of the benefits is sometimes we don't have to wear shoes with these online platforms, and so we get to be comfy and cozy and curl up with their pups or our kittens sometimes during these, and still be able to have access to such wonderful presenters, such knowledgeable people in our communities, and to be able to reach out and, though it's through the screen, still feel like we can be together as one during this time. Marilyn and Georgie says, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. Barbara says the same thing, Widow, for the informative and rich presentation this morning. We've got important history, and important history still in the making. So Widow for sharing that with us. And so, yeah, love just keeps pouring in, and thank you so much for your time. And we know what it takes to put these types of presentations together. It's not just the showing up and spending an hour. It's the years of experience and being able to put together the amount of details and resources for us in one place. And some of the things that I've learned in this presentation is at all of the books, I took a screenshot of that for myself too. And so thank you so much for sharing those resources for those of us who would like to continue learning on such an important topic. And so personally, I appreciate your presentation this morning. And if no one else has any direct questions, Marilyn, I do want to open it up to you just one more time and to share any closing remarks that you have for us. And if we don't have any more questions or any questions that come in during that time, then we can go ahead and wrap up our session. And sometimes you leave no questions.
Well,
and so I think this presentation.
Yes, there was a question. Can you hear me? Okay.
We can,
there was
yes.
Someone who had a question. Did I anticipate that there would be continuing opposition to Freedman tribal membership? And I will say, unfortunately, I think there will be persons that will have opposition. Now, one of the reasons I talked about the Jim Crow laws earlier in Oklahoma was that persons that didn't have African ancestry really didn't have to face those kind of laws. And there are people that they may feel people of African ancestry are their social inferiors because that was the way it was in the state of Oklahoma for many years. And there are some people that, I don't want to say it. They believe in stereotypes that persons of African ancestry have, although, and one of the reasons that I listed some of the noted persons of African ancestry that are Cherokee Freedmen descendants is to put a spotlight on some of these notable people. There are Cherokee Freedmen descendants, people who are attorneys, who are engineers. I'm an engineer. Persons who are, real estate investors. It's unfortunate that, that there are people that would have stereotypes, but there are people of the majority race that they have stereotypes against Native Americans, which are all false. As I said, then you have people that don't know that much about the history of the Cherokee Nation. There are people in certain communities, and as an engineer, I've traveled all around the United States, and I've met many Cherokee people, and I've asked them, do you know a lot about the tribe? Are you involved? And some people, they know the name of the chief, or they know the name of the former chief. There are people that I've talked to 2 or 3 years ago, and they thought Mr. Smith was still the chief. Or they said, oh, yeah, I know the name of my council people. It's Mr. Phillips. Well, Mr. Phillips has been deceased for quite a while off the council. Or they think it's Mr. Don Crittenden, and he's also been deceased. So I said, there's a lot of people who are not keeping up. Or unfortunately, they would prefer to listen to some propaganda rather than dig it out for themselves. There are also politicians that they feel that they can gain power in the tribe by demonizing the freedmen. We don't want them. They were forced on us, or whatever. And again, they're listened to by some people. So I expect there will be some opposition. And there are people in the council right now that oppose freedmen citizenship. There were some that were on the previous council. There were some that on the council that just went out. There were some that worked very hard on the petition that was found by the federal government to be illegal. And again, all of the fraud. There were some persons that I mentioned. There were 8 individuals who had tried to force the Attorney General to appeal the Judge Hogan's decision. Well, the tribal government, the Attorney General's office, determined that some of those persons had committed perjury based on what they filed. Again, this is all of this is public knowledge for the people to look at. And so as I said, there are people that they have their own reasons, but they continue to oppose the freedmen. I don't know that that's going to change for a while.
Thank you so much for that, Marilyn. At this time, we're going to have to go ahead and wrap up here. I believe that we have a couple of questions that have been posed in the chat, and so Marilyn, I'm going to defer those questions and those individuals just to reach out to you directly for some personal correspondence, if that's okay.
That's fine, ma'am. That's fine.
Okay. Yes. So thank you all so much for being here with us this morning. And thank you for your patience as we get started. And we encourage you to attend as many sessions as you can this today. And I'm going to go ahead and just before we close out, I'm going to put our slideshow back up with Marilyn's contact information so that everyone has it and that's available. And Marilyn, it sounds like some people are going to contact you directly. So that's our purpose, is to continue to grow our networks amongst ourselves and our communities and at large as well. So thank you all for being here this morning, Wadon, and hope that you go grab a snack, come back and meet us for our next session. So thank you all for being here for today. I'm going to go ahead and bring out the PowerPoint one more time so that everyone has Marilyn's contact information if you missed it. And if you don't need that or grabbed it already, then feel free to leave at this time. Widow Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much.